In 1946, moviegoers got their first glimpse of an astonishing new machine.
Are people becoming obsolete? A giant electronic brain is starting cogitating at the University of Pennsylvania. It's made of vacuum tubes, like your radio, and it can add up a column of figures a yard long in a second. It's the world's first electronic computer. Right now, it's solving mathematical problems for the U.S. Army, but who knows? Someday a machine like this may check up on your income tax.
You're right. I muted myself so that you could hear the video. Were you able to hear the video that I just sent around? I'm better. I got the sound now. Were you able to see the video? Can you see me now? Surely you can hear me now. Hello, can you hear me now? Okay, crap. Can you still hear me? You can still hear me, right? I'm sorry, I was trying to be slick today. Were you able to hear the video that I sent around? Were you able to hear the video that I sent around? I'm sorry, I tried to start off with something a little bit different today. What I wanted you to see, I don't know if you folks know this, but back in the old days before they had TVs and television stations, if you wanted to get your news, you had to go to the movie theaters. And before they played the movie, they would have news shorts. Exactly, right? Aren't they cool, Andrea? And what you just saw there was an advertisement for the first computer, which was introduced in the late 40s. I don't know if you folks ever knew that, but computers haven't always been here. And computers are very important for this week's topic. We're going to be talking about cognitive psychology. And what I want you to know is that along with some experimental findings that demonstrated we needed to think about the mind, probably the most important thing in the development of cognitive psychology was the invention of the computer, which was an electronic brain that processed information. Good morning, Logan. Good to see you. We were just talking about the introduction of the computer, the invention of the computer as being very important for the cognitive perspective. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the cognitive perspective and information processing. I'm going to introduce to you a model of how the mind might work. And then we're going to talk about some strategies for creating more durable long-term memories. It's good to see everybody today. I see we've got almost 10 people in the audience. Thanks for coming. I really do appreciate that. Okay, now let's start off by talking about cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is the subfield of psychology that studies how human beings encode, store, and retrieve information. How do we process information in our mind? If you remember, the beginning of psychology was brought about by the demonstration that the mind was systematic and could be measured. That happened in 1950. It took almost 100 years before psychology would get back around to really trying to understand all of the intricate processes that this symbolic mind can engage in. And a newer approach to cognitive psychology is called cognitive neuroscience, where they try to figure out how the brain engages in these thinking and thought processes. Now, where did the cognitive approach come from? Well, if you remember last week, we were talking about the behaviorists. And for the behaviorists, we didn't need to think about the mind or mental ability. For the behaviorist, all we had to do was think about reinforcements and punishments and how it affected behavior. But there were a bunch of psychologists who thought that this was not the proper way to do psychology. They thought it was important and interesting for us to try and understand how the brain processes information. You have to keep in mind, behaviorists were not interested in mental concepts at all. They thought that the mind shouldn't be measured and probably that the mind couldn't be measured. That's why they were called behaviorists. And up until 1940 ish, behaviorists ruled the field of psychology. And so people doing mental research were kind of sidelined. They weren't the most important people in psychology. But with the invention of the computer in the 40s, this was proof positive that human brains could be important for processing information. Why? Because somebody had created an electronic brain that could process information. Now, what do computers do? If you think about it, computers receive input. We type into computers, right? These computers have processors and they have what do you call it? An operating system, and that operating system has rules for how it processes information. And when you type that input in, it's processed by the computer and it produces output. You know what? Human beings engage in the same basic processes. We know that human beings encode information. When we use the word encode in psychology, we talk about putting information in the mind. All right. If you encode information into your conscious awareness, you are now thinking about what I am saying. If you remember what I am saying, you have to at least encode it in your long term memory. Now we know that human beings store information just like computers do. For example, who was the first president of the United States? I bet each and every one of you out there in my video audience can tell me that it was George Washington. Holy cow, you stored that information in your brain. And then we know that human beings engage in this process called retrieval, where we re access this information that we've stored in our mind. Have any of you ever had difficulty accessing information that you have in your brain? Have you ever had somebody ask you a question and you're like, man, I know the answer, but I just can't think about it, right? So we know that human beings engage in encoding information, they store information, and they retrieve that information. And so we use these as the basis for developing a theory about how the mind works. If you know that human minds must encode, must store, and must retrieve information, we can begin to set up experiments to try to understand what systematic rules the mind engages in and the mind follows. All right. So, for the next couple of days, what I'm going to be trying to do is to explain to you how the mind works, what its qualities are, how it stores and operates and processes information, and how it is similar to and different from a computer, which engages in pretty much the same behaviors. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about the model of information processing. In your book, in chapter 7, you're going to see this particular picture right here. It's the three-part memory storage system. It's usually known as the Atkinson and Shiffren model of information processing. And what this model suggests is that human beings engage in three different types of informational processes. Now, this is a box memory, and I've got a box memory for my sensory storage. I've got a box for my short-term storage, and I've got a box for my long-term storage. Don't think of these as places. Think of these as processes that your brain engages in. So they're what we call sensory processes. They're what we call short-term memory processes, and they're what we call long-term memory processes. And this right here represents a pretty good schematic for how your mind works. And so for the test, for you moving on and leaving this class, I want you to be familiar with this 3-box model of memory. Okay? Now, how is our mind divided? Our mind is divided into a preconscious part, a conscious part, and a subconscious part. Okay? Before you're aware of information, it goes into your sensory storage, which is a preconscious, a pre awareness part of your mind. While you are thinking about what I am saying, it is in your short term memory, it is in your conscious memory. And if you decide to remember what it is I am talking to you about, you are then storing it in a subconscious part of your mind called your long term storage. So that's how we process information. 3 ways: we have a sensory storage, we have a short term storage, and we have a long term storage. So, your sensory memory is where things go before you are actually aware of it. You may not realize this, but things are in your mind before you are aware of them. They go into this part of your mind, and this part of your mind acts like a filter, and it allows you to select what it is you will pay attention to. And we learn through experience what things to pay attention to. Information doesn't last in your short-term memory very long at all, in your sensory memory very long at all. In fact, research has suggested that this part of your mind, things that go into this part of your mind, only last for less than half a second. All right? This is a short-term memory store that allows you to decide what it is you are going to pay attention to. If you decide to pay attention to something, it comes into this part of your mind we're going to call your short term memory. This is your conscious awareness. This is all the things you can pay attention to at one time. Now, if any of you are in the emergency technology field, if any of you have ever worked in an ambulance, if any of you have ever worked in a doctor's office, you may hear them talking about short term memory as that thing that you can remember from the last 24 hours of what happened. I'm not talking about that EMT short term memory. I'm talking about your conscious awareness. Now, this conscious awareness is limited in size, and information only stays in this part of your mind while you are thinking about it, while you are processing that information. If you decide to remember something, if you decide to study something so that you can remember it for a test, if you are actually successful in sticking it in your memory and bringing it out for the test, it has to go into your long term memory. And your long term memory is typically what we talk about when we tell people, hey, my memory is gone. I've forgotten something. My memory isn't as good as it used to be. You're actually talking about your long term memory. And this is where you store information while you're not using it, but it's a place where you can call information in order to use it. So, for example, all of you know what the answer to the math question 2 plus 2 is. Can somebody tell me what's the answer to the math question? What is 2 plus 2? Go ahead and type that in the chat bar and let me know. Da 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 da. 4! Holy cow, Andrea, Michelle, Andrea Nicole knows it's 4. Here's the deal, Andrea. At some point, somebody told you that it was in your short term memory, and you learned that, and then you stuck it in your long term memory. Now, were you thinking about the number 4 before I asked you, Nicole and Eli? Absolutely not. But you were able to pull that information from your long term memory back into your conscious awareness. I could ask you a question right now. Who is our current president? And all of you, whether you like him or not, would all be able to tell me it is who is our current president, whether you like him or not. You all know that. That information was pulled out of your long term storage memory. You weren't thinking Joe Biden, but you pulled that out into your conscious awareness. So you can think about your mind as having these three basic memory stores. A part of your mind where stuff goes before you're aware of it. Okay? A part of your mind where stuff goes while you're actually thinking about it. And then there's a part of your mind where stuff goes that you want to use for later, like your long term storage. Okay. So these are the three sort of parts of your mind that cognitive psychologists study. So there have been lots of research studies demonstrating the limitations in the abilities of your sensory storage. There are lots of research studies that have demonstrated the limits and shortcomings of your short term storage. And then psychologists have spent a lot of time studying the ways in which we store information that we are going to use later. So I want you to be familiar with these three memory stores. Now, we've already talked about them in a way. Do you folks remember this from a couple weeks ago? I asked you to read the color of the ink that these words are written in. So instead of saying purple, yellow, red, you should say red, blue, green, yellow, green, black, blue, red, yellow, black, yellow, blue, green, red, black, right? And so what you're noticing is even though you want to bring the color of the ink up into your mind, what is coming into your mind at the same time? The semantic memory. The semantic memory. Why is it that you'd rather read purple for the top first word than red for the first word? Well, that's because the semantic information is trying to break into your conscious awareness. Now, when you looked at this sign, the color of the ink and the semantic information are both in your sensory memory. But your memory has been trained to pull one thing into consciousness while not pulling the other thing into consciousness. So you can think of your sensory memory, both of them are in your consciousness or in your mind, but only one gets pulled into your consciousness. So, what I want you to know is that you have this sensory memory and it acts as a filter, letting some things through and not letting other things through. Do you folks remember the dancing bear experiment we did from a couple of weeks ago where I had the moonwalking bear and it was dressed in black? But I told you to pay attention to the people in white passing the basketball. And what did you notice about you, right? What did you notice? A lot of you missed the moonwalking bear. It came into your sensory memory, but you decided not to pay attention to it. And so, what George Sperling, the guy who discovered the sensory memory, discovered is that we have this part of our mind where things go just for a brief second, and we decide what it is we're going to pay attention to, right? And that explains why we didn't see the moonwalking bear, but once we see the moonwalking bear, we can never unsee it. That's what explains why, when you're given a list of words printed in different colored ink, you would rather read the semantic information in the color of the ink that the word is in, because your brain is trained to pull some things into conscious awareness. Now you're seeing it all, but only some of it gets into awareness. It all goes into your sensory memory, but only some of it gets into your your short term memory. Now, really cool study that was done in the 60s. They put these headphones on people and they gave them what's known as the dichotic listening task. They would tell them, pay attention to your left ear and don't listen to what's in your right ear. They would then play them two lists of words, one list of words in their left ear and one list of words in their right ear. And after playing them that list of words, let's say 50 words in each ear, they would then give them a list of 150 words. 50 words that were in their left ear, 50 words that were in their right ear, and 50 words that they'd never heard before. And what they found was that when you ask people to pay attention to one ear, it's almost as if they don't hear the words in the unattended ear. If you ask them to circle all the words they heard, they never circle the words that were in their right ear. However, there's one exception. If you play their name in the right ear, even though the person is listening to the left ear, for some reason they are able to hear their name in the unattended ear. Does that make sense to you? That's known as the cocktail party effect. If you've ever been at a party and you're hanging out and you found somebody you find really interesting and you're talking to that one person, all the noise in that room just seems to fade away. And the only person you hear is the person you're talking to at a cocktail party. But if somebody across the room says, that guy, Chris Roddenberry, even though you're not paying attention, it bursts into your awareness. So, what I want you to gain from today is that in understanding how the mind works, I want you to know there is a part of your mind called the sensory memory where, where input comes in and you can choose what it is you are going to pay attention to. This thing is a filter, if you will. So stuff is in your mind even before you are aware of it. Now, if you choose not to pay attention to it, kind of like the dancing bear, and I ask you about the dancing bear, you will say, I never saw it. I never ever saw it. Okay? And so this is the sensory memory, the first part of your mental processing. Now, let's talk about the second part of your mind, your conscious awareness. Now, your short term memory is the stuff that you can keep in your mind at one time. So, how about I'm going to do this? I need you to stop by the grocery store and pick me up some items from the grocery store. Okay, Sarah, Ashley, Logan, I'm going to give you some words, some things I need for you to pick up from the grocery store. Don't write this list of words down, but I need you to pick me up some broccoli, some butter. I need you to pick me up some cheese, some soda, some bottled water. I need deodorant. I need cat food. I need some garlic powder. I need some tomato soup. I need you to get me some coffee, some sugar, and some creamer. Uh, can you remember everything I asked you to pick up? Andrea, Logan, Sarah. Did you get all of those items? Are you going to pick up the broccoli? Are you going to pick up the milk I asked you for? Are you going to remember to get me the tomato soup, the garlic powder? Are you going to get the coffee and the sugar? Or have you forgotten some of that stuff, right? If you forgot some of that stuff, then you're demonstrating the limitation of what we might call your short term memory. Your short term memory is the number of things that you can hold in your mind at any one time, the number of things that you can pay attention to at any one time. The number of things that you can hold in your short term memory span is called your digit span. And there are individual differences. Some of you have better memories for a list of items than other people do. Did any of you, when you heard that list of words that I was just saying, did any of you put the sugar and the coffee together when I was talking? Hmm? Did any of you put the sugar and the coffee together? Did any of you put the broccoli and the cheese together and try to remember them as one unit? If you're doing that, then you are engaging in chunking. So hold on, let's see. Okay. Here's the deal. I'm going to read you a list of letters. I want you to tell me if you can remember. There you and the soup and the garlic powder. Fantastic. All right, here's the deal. What happens when you overwhelm the short-term memory? I'm actually going to read you one, two, three, four. Uh, there you go. I'm going to read you uh, 15 letters in a row. I want you to write these words down, these letters down in perfect order if you can. Okay? I'm going to read these. Are you ready? See if you can write these 15. See if you can remember these. Don't start writing until I'm done, but see if you can remember these. A, B, C, N, B, C, C, B, S, M, T, V, H, B, O. How many of you would be able to write down all 15 of those letters in a row? Can you do it? Can you do it? I'll even read it one more time. A, B, C, N, B, C, C, B, S, M, T, V, H, B, O. Were you folks able to write down all 15 of those letters in order? I'll bet you weren't. But you know what? Let me change the presentation order for just a little bit. Okay, how about this? Would this be any easier? ABC, NBC, CBS, MTV, HBO. Now, do you think you could write all of those letters down in a row? What's the difference between reading number one and reading number two? Can anybody tell me what's the difference between reading number one and reading number two? A, B, C, N, B, C, C, B, S, M, T, V, H, B, O. That's one way. And the others is ABC, NBC, CBS, MTV, HBO. What's the difference in those two readings of the same 15 letters? Can anybody tell me why it would be easier to remember it the second time? Oh, Imani's right. The second time around, you're not trying to remember 15 letters. You're instead, exactly, Cole. But I think Imani has it right. If you look at this level, do you see I have one, two, three, four, five studio names, right? Okay. When I read it the first time, you have to try to remember all 15 of these dots. Okay? When I read it the second time, you're able to see the links in between these items and you're able to chunk them together just like we can relate to the way the second group was read. Yes, Ashley. Yes, I put them in a group. So here's the key. Your short-term memory, your ability to remember a list of items, a list of things to get at the grocery store, a way to remember names, or a way to remember anything is to when you're trying to remember something, you can only remember seven plus or minus two chunks. This is called Miller's magic number. And a fellow named George Miller found that human beings in general, if you give them a list or something to remember, they can remember somewhere between 5 and 9 items. But people who have really good memory have understood the idea that it's 5 or 9 chunks. And a chunk can be as big as you want. So, for example, a chunk could be a letter A, B, C. Or a chunk could be ABC, right? So, is this one, two? 1, 2, 3 chunks, or is it one chunk? Is this 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, or is this 2? Is this 7, 8, 9, or is it 3? 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, right? But what I've done is I have chunked it into larger chunks. Now tonight, when we get to in webinar tonight, I'm going to be showing you how to supercharge your memory. I don't know if you know this, but there are people in the world who are memory athletes. They are normal human beings just like you and me. But what they've realized is that memory is a skill and an ability that can be trained. And these people have learned how to use chunking and visual imagery to create superhuman memories. And what I'm going to do in webinar tonight is I'm going to show you how to supercharge your memories by using chunking and visual imagery, right? I saw a video of a guy who sat with 120 people who each said their name and named an object of some sort. And when they all finished, he went through and repeated each name and object accurately. Yes, 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 Ashley. That is exactly what that guy was doing is he was creating an image of that person using that object. And I swear to God, you would be surprised. I saw a guy spend 20 minutes looking at 10 decks of cards, okay? A deck of cards has 52 cards. This guy studied 520 cards for 20 minutes, and at the end of 20 minutes, he was given a test where he was asked to name the card from each deck, and he did it correctly. So, for example, I might say, name the 20th card from the fourth deck, and he was able to go, that was the two of diamonds. Okay, what's the 15th card from the seventh deck? And he's like, that was the queen of diamonds. And the crazy thing is, Ashley Nicole, uh, uh, and Amani, is that these people are not extraordinary. They just know, they have realized that memory is not something you're born with. It's a skill you can develop. And that's what I'm going to teach you tonight and Thursday night in webinar. I don't want you people to run around saying, I have a good memory or I have a bad memory. Instead, the appropriate thing to say is, I have a well trained memory, I have a poorly trained memory. Memory is not something you're born with as much as it is something you learn to develop. It is a skill. It is a skill. And so, if you can learn the idea that people can only remember 7 or 8 chunks, and the idea is to make chunks of large sizes, and that allows you to store memories in your mind, right? So, example, you can think of cat as 3 letters, CAT, or you can put them together to form the word cat, or you can actually learn a sentence, cat in the hat, right? And so cat in the hat could be 5, 7, 10 letters, or it can be 4 words, or it can be one sentence. And all of those are chunks. And so the key to memory, the key to the short-term memory is learning how to chunk things as they are presented to you. I hope that makes sense. Now, uh, research has been done, and I want you to look at that chart over on the left-hand side, studying what happens when you stress out the short-term memory. What happens if I give you a list of words that's too long? So, what if I give you a list of 25 things to pick up from the grocery store? Surely you're not going to remember all 25 things. What things are you going to remember? Well, if you'll look at this list right, this is known as the serial position effect. And along the x-axis is the word in its position. So the first word I presented to you, then the fifth word I presented to you, the 10th word I presented to you, the 15th word I presented to you, the 20th word I presented to you, then the 25th word I presented to you, okay? And then on the y-axis is your likelihood of remembering that word. And what I want you to see is that if I stress out your short-term memory, you are more likely to remember the first word you heard, and you're more likely to remember the last word you heard. But the thing that we're most likely to forget is the middle words in the list that we are given. Okay? And one final note, when we get to IQ tests, we're actually going to talk about them next week. IQ tests, one of the things that they measure in IQ tests is the size of your short-term memory. On an IQ test, it's called your digit span, but it's how many things that you can juggle in your mind at one time. And although the average is 7 plus or minus 2, some of you have better short-term memories than others. And check this out. The size of your digit span is positively correlated to your reading comprehension ability. People with larger digit spans are better at reading than people with smaller digit spans. Okay? And so that's the second part of your memory. We have a preconscious part called your sensory memory. Okay, right? And this is where information comes in before you decide to pay attention. It's a filter and it decides what gets into your conscious awareness and what doesn't. What gets into your conscious decision depends upon what you want to get into your consciousness and also what you are trained to pay attention to. Once things get into your short-term consciousness, okay, they're in your short-term storage and they can stay in there as long as you rehearse the items. If you want to remember the word dog, and you keep saying dog, 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 it will stay in your awareness as long as you rehearse it. But once you stop rehearsing it, that information is only going to last in your short-term memory for around 20 to 25 seconds. Okay, 20 to 25 seconds. Now, in order for something to go from your short-term memory into your long-term memory, you have to rehearse it. You have to think about it the right way. And what I want you to know today is that there are two ways that you can think about things in your mind. The first is what we call maintenance rehearsal. You can just think about something. You can just repeat it over and over in your mind. How many of you have ever studied for a test by reading your notes? How many of you study for a test by reading your notes over and over and over again? Do any of you do that? If you do that, you're engaging in maintenance rehearsal. And maintenance rehearsal is not going to lead to the best memory trace. So, if you've ever been given a phone number by somebody, let's say this was in the days before we had cell phones and you could program somebody's information in, but back in the 80s, if you met an attractive person and wanted to call them later, you had to remember their phone number until you could write it down. So you might meet somebody and they're like, okay, my phone number is 555-1212. One way to remember that would be just to repeat it over and over again. 555-1212. 555-12. And then you run around repeating it over until you get a pen and can write that down. But if you've ever been like me, somebody will say a number, you'll think about something else for 1 second, and you know what happens? That number disappears right out of your head. A better way to get stuff from your short-term memory to your long-term memory is to engage in what we call elaborative rehearsal. And elaborative rehearsal is studying that involves relating the information to items that are already stored in your mind. Let me give you an example. I met this guy one time and he was from Sanford, and his phone number was 776 1066. Now, here's the deal. I could have said that number over and over to myself, trying to remember it. 776 1066, 776 1066. But you know what? I remember my friend Linwood's phone number, and it took me less than 2 seconds to store that as a permanent memory. I actually learned this memory 20 years ago, and I have not forgotten it. Do you want to know why I remember my friend Linwood's phone number? It's because I've related these two numbers to different historical events. I'm kind of a history buff, so I'm big on dates. Can anybody tell me what historical date looks like 776? Can anybody tell me what historical date kind of reminds them of 776? Can anybody think of a historical date that might relate to 776? Anybody? Anybody? What date reminds you of 776? Now, if we have any international students in here, I'll forgive you for not knowing this, but if you grew up in the United States, you better know this one. The Declaration of Independence. Very good. 1776. Or the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to write it as DOI, Logan. Good for you. Absolutely. Now, I'm a super nerd and a history buff, but does anybody know the significance of the date 1066? I'll bet you don't. But if you were a history nut, you would know this. Okay, to me, this is the Battle of Hastings. I know you don't know that, and that's fine. That's completely fine, folks. That is completely fine. Okay, but I knew that. And you know what? You may have a different date. 1066 may mean something else to you, but 1066 means the Norman invasion and the Battle of Hastings. So, do you want to know how I remembered my friend Linwood's phone number? There, Battle of Hastings. Nicole, if you knew that, Andrea and Nicole, if you knew that without me asking, I would be so impressed with you, I promise, okay? So here's the deal. How did I remember my friend's phone number? As soon as I saw it, I said Battle of Hastings and Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. And as soon as I remembered those two events that I already had in my mind, anytime somebody says, "Hey, what's Linwood's phone number?" I have to think for a minute and I think about those two historical events. And that's because I've already got them stored in my mind in my history schema. Now, how does this work? This works because your mind is organized in what we call schemas. And these schemas are basically knowledge structures that contain all the mental associations that you have for a concept. For an example, here's what I'd like for you to do. I'm into medieval history and Oh, Andrea is a nerd. You know what, Andrea? I've been doing this demonstration for probably 15 years now, and nobody's ever guessed the Battle of Hastings. So thank you for joining me in super nerddom. I'm really, really impressed and proud that you're a nerd like me. Now, here's the thing. Let's demonstrate this idea of a schema. A schema is basically a knowledge structure that contains the mental associations you have for a concept. So, what I want to do is I'm going to say a word to you and I want you to tell me all the things that pop into your mind when you hear the word circus. Circus. Okay, now if you would, please go ahead and tell me what comes to your mind when you hear the word circus. Go ahead and be typing those words in the chat bar, and I'm going to be doing the same thing. Okay, what pops into your mind when you hear the word circus? When you hear the word circus. Oh, Logan Phillips with a clown. Nice. Well done, Logan. What else? An elephant. Yes, what else? Holy cow. You might be right. circus, elephants, lions, clowns. Holy cow. Look at this. Check this out. This is what I wrote down when I wrote circus. I wrote clown, elephant, lions, the big tops, the popcorns. And you know what, Ashley Nicole? I could have put acrobats too. Very good. This is what's known as a in tightrope, and the acrobats on the tightrope. Now, you know what? This is what's known as a schema. This is what's known as a schema. So, if you wanted to remember something, let's say I gave you some words to remember, and three of those words were clown, elephant, and lions. You know what you might want to do in order to remember and stick those words in your mind is imagine a picture of the circus, and there are lions and clowns and elephants at that circus. And so what you're doing when you're using elaborative rehearsal is you're using the schemas that you already have in your mind, and you're using those as memory cues to help stick stuff in your mind. So I have a schema in my brain called historical dates. And 776 and 1776 and 1066 are already in my schema. So whenever I want to remember something, I use my schema. Now, I will tell you, I'm not going to tell you my entire 16-digit credit card number because I don't trust you folks. But the uh, 12th through 16th numbers on my credit card are 1957. 1957. You know what? I remember that because that's the year my oldest brother was born. So I can remember that 16-digit number because I have four dates that go along with that number. Do any of you have other sort of associations in your brain that pop up when you think of numbers and ideas? How many of you folks use that? And you know what? A set of schemas is known as an association network. So what I could do is, if you want, I could go here to elephant and I can say elephant goes to Africa. Elephants, because you see them in Africa. And you know what? In Africa, there is deserts, mountains, diamonds. Uh, there is deserts, mountains, diamonds. There's Nigeria, right? So Africa is a schema, circus is a schema, and you'll notice that they are connected by elephants in Africa. So this is an association network composed of two schemas. So, in a sense, if you really, really, really want to get something from your short term memory into your long term memory, you have to learn how to elaborate it. And tonight, when you come to class, I'm going to show you how to use the different parts of your brain, different biological parts of your brain, like different kinds of memory traces. And if you can learn how to elaborate using the strengths of your mind, of your brain, you can learn to supercharge your memory. I'm from Africa, and maybe that's why the first thing that popped up into my mind. It absolutely is Imani. It absolutely is when you heard elephant. And that's the cool thing. Everybody's schemas, we all have similar schemas, but we all have unique schemas that work just for us. And so the deal is, don't use my schema. Don't use a schema you're told to use. Use a schema that you already have in your mind, right? Fantastic. Now, if what I want to do is I want to summarize the information that we went over today. If you go look in your chapter, you're going to see this chart right here. And it's going to tell you what your sensory memory does, what your short-term memory is, and what your long-term memory is. It's going to tell you how it encodes memory. It's going to tell you how long the information lasts there. And it's going to tell you the capacity of that storage memory is. Okay. And so, what I want you to do is to be familiar with these three parts of our intellectual functioning. Okay. Your mind, your mind is composed of these three types of storage areas. Okay. Now, that's all we really have for today, but today's lesson was for you to do understand two things: how the cognitive psychology perspective was born. It was born because the behaviors didn't have all the answers, and because we had this invention of a thing called a computer, which does just what we believe human minds do. Human beings encode information, they store information, and they retrieve that information. And I want you to know that we have sort of three basic mental processes that our minds engage in when we are processing information. We have a sensory memory, we have a short term memory, and we have a long term memory. Now, what I'm going to do tonight in webinar and Thursday in class is I'm going to talk to you about how we can improve our memory so that we don't forget things like we usually do. All right? Now, that's all I have to say for today's lecture. Does anybody have any questions? I would like to thank you for coming today. I appreciate your participation and your continued attendance in these webinars. It's really gratifying to see that you're still coming. I am working on grading your week 6 homework, and I will have that graded by Thursday of this week. I was a little bit slow last week grading your homework. I will be much quicker this week grading your homework. If you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and log off now. If you do want to talk to me, don't hesitate to send me a text or an email. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you tonight at 8 p.m. Have a great day.